Good morning, colleagues. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Transformation Strategy Group session. The Transformation Strategy Group is formed to advise the board on how to accelerate and deepen transformation within the university sector and to develop short, medium to long-term strategies to address transformation matters in the sector. The group advises the board on emerging good practices and on practices with the potential to undermine transformation in the sector. The 2021 priorities of the Transformation Strategy Group are the reconstruction of institutional culture by focusing on the design of universities around our students and staff, with emphasis on residences and the curriculum, establishing a national project to theorize and build models of universities that are seriously engaged in the local context in which they find themselves. Of course, to prepare for the National Higher Education Conference 2021, and to review practices related to people with disabilities in higher education, with the view to improving responses, to positively influence higher education sector responses to gender-based violence, and of current the inequalities highlighted by COVID-19. The USAf strategy groups have focused teams and sub-themes as per their respective strategic plans and aligned to the conference theme of the engaged university. The Transformation Strategy Group session focus on 3 sub-themes, this being the engaged university and transformation, student-centered universities, the responsive university. For this particular session, we will be focusing on the theme student-centered universities. The lived experiences of our students, as highlighted in the fees must fall era, reflected the significant levels of alienation that our students experience in their learning environment. This raises the question of how should our universities be designed to alleviate this alienation that many students experience. And what kind of university environment will enhance student development and success? And what is required for our students to enjoy a positive university experience? And more importantly, what do we know about our students, their expectations, their realities, their indigenous knowledge, their aspirations, how they learn and develop in higher education? Knowing our students' needs can only better shape the design, plan, and delivery of a higher education experience that is relevant, responsive, rewarding, and meaningful for our students. So this session will reflect on our analysis that universities, given the diversity of students within its spaces, have not designed themselves in line with the principles of student-centeredness. These principles included, but are not limited to, social and physical spaces, curriculum, student histories and contexts, the administrative regime, knowledges and research, modes of learning and teaching, extracurricular arrangements, safety and security, anti and non-discrimination, to name just a few. So this session, colleagues, on student-centered universities comprises 2 parts, commencing with presentations by 2 speakers, followed by 4 respondents. And to take you through this process, I hand you over to our session chair, Professor Lourens van Staden. Professor van Staden, over to you.
Okay, good morning, colleagues. I'm Lourens van Staden, the chair of the session. I'm the Vice-Chancellor at the Tshwane University of Technology. It is my privilege now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sibusiso Chalufu. The abridged biographics of all the speakers and respondents are available on the digital conference booklet. I now hand over to Dr. Chalufu.
Thank you very much, Chair. Distinguished guests, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It is indeed a great honor and a privilege to have been invited as one of the speakers in this segment of the conference with a focus on the idea of student-centered universities. Of course, this conference, which is happening at a time of a global pandemic, provides us with an excellent opportunity to engage in deep reflection and discourse about the time prior to, during, and possibilities for a post-COVID-19 higher education world. Part of the reflection entails one having to appreciate the shift in universities' thinking, especially with respect to the critical role that is played by student support service staff, particularly student affairs and services practitioners. In the not so distant past, student affairs and services practitioners were primarily in the periphery of strategic focus and institutional operations, Prof. Phakeng. And as some have quipped, we were referred to as those guys who keep students busy when they are not engaged academically, and whose primary role is actually just of ensuring that students are not engaged in any disruptive protest. We've come quite a long way since then, and we must appreciate the shift that has happened in the thinking and in the practice of universities. It is interesting to note the central role that we have been called upon as student affairs and services practitioners to play, roughly since the time of the Fees Must Fall, or the Fallist movement as it were. And most recently, when, for example, issues around mental health of students were foregrounded in the midst of the pandemic, it was actually student affairs and services practitioners who were called upon for support. I must say, Chair, that I found this session to be quite fascinating, especially the focus. As I was thinking about the conference theme in general, and the session focus in particular, one of the critical questions that came to mind was, if students are at the center of the business of universities, in other words, the raisons d'etre, the reason for their existence, why wouldn't they be, why wouldn't universities be student-centered? Just something to ponder. Perhaps the question that we should ask ourselves is, student-centeredness for what? And this is, in my view, links up very nicely with the question of the purpose of higher education that was addressed in yesterday's sessions. In the chapter from the recent International Association of Universities book, which is called The Promise of Higher Education, Essays in Honor of 70 Years of IAU, Ira Haggerty argues that the most significant purpose of the university is education for citizenship, specifically educating able, ethical, empathetic, engaged, and effective democratic citizens of a democratic society. Related to that are the questions that were raised yesterday about the role of universities in addressing societal challenges. Again, in this chapter, Prof. Ira, who spoke yesterday, posits that the other central purpose of universities is to develop the knowledge that is needed to change the world for the better. That, in my view, is quite profound in thinking about student-centeredness, which is an anchor on the understanding of higher education as a public good. I wish to argue, Chair, this morning that student-centeredness is intricately linked to the work of student affairs and services practitioners, whose role and purpose is actually to contribute to the holistic development of students as well-rounded, innovative, and socially responsive local leaders in service of humanity. To quote Pankaj Mitta in the chapter that is contributed in 2021, writing about the higher education in India, and I quote, "The emphasis is on holistic development of the student, leading to complete realization and liberalization of oneself," end of quote. Without a doubt, issues of student access and success, which Dr. Pillay alluded to, overall student well-being and welfare are at the center of our concern and focus as student affairs and services practitioners. I want to argue that our proximity to and work with students places us at a vantage point or vantage position to ensure that our institutions adopt truly student-centered approaches to governance, to management, to teaching and learning, and to the overall operations of higher education institutions. I also want to say that we've actually seen a major shift in the relationship between student affairs and services practitioners and student leaders, something that we really do appreciate and we don't take for granted. We've seen a more collaborative approach, which has become quite palpable. Perhaps it was buttressed by the conditions that were occasioned by COVID-19, when we all realized that we really needed to work together and we needed to collaborate. So working with the USAf's Prof. Bauer and other stakeholders, student affairs and services practitioners were able to collaborate with student leaders to deal with the challenges of COVID-19, amongst others, the development of a social compact template, which was developed to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 at South African universities, serves as one of the illustrative examples of this collaborative approach that I've alluded to earlier. The next point that I wish to make, Chair, is that we cannot speak of student-centeredness without alluding to the issue of institutional culture at our institutions. As cogently argued by Dr. Sizwe Mabizela last year, the creation of a vibrant intellectual, social, and cultural environment is key to the achievement of academic excellence. And indeed, this assertion by Dr. Mabizela is borne out by previous research studies, especially the early 2000s, by authors such as Aston and Aston, who have asserted in their work on student involvement that student involvement is linked to greater levels of satisfaction with university experience and also linked to strong academic performance. To be sure, through earlier research work, we've developed a good understanding of a strong correlation between student engagement and student access, with student engagement, of course, being linked to student satisfaction, to persistence, to academic achievement, and to social engagement. To revert to the issue of institutional culture, I wish to argue this morning that we need to ask ourselves, to what extent do our universities create a caring and supportive institutional culture and an affirming environment, which brings about a sense of belonging and a feeling of being at home, which was argued by Lionel Thava in 2006. The alienation that has been experienced by our students, which again, Dr. Pillay alluded to, has been well documented. Apart from the massive documentation of experiences of students broadly associated with the Fallist movement, the seminal work by Charlene Swartz and her colleagues in a book entitled Studying While Black, Race, Education, and Emancipation in South African Universities is quite instructive. While talking about institutional cultures, one must acknowledge the research study commissioned by USAf's Transformation Strategy Group on reshaping institutional cultures to create a student-centered higher education system in South Africa, which I'm sure some of the respondents in this session will allude to. In closing, Chairperson, and keeping with the theme of this conference, I was fascinated by what the National Coordinating Center for Public Engagement in the UK had to say about an engaged university, particularly as this relates to students. They argue that an engaged university proactively includes and involves students in shaping the mission and in the delivery of the strategy, and that it maximizes opportunities for their involvement. In 2020, the Council of Higher Education journal called Kagiso published a series of articles on student governance and engagement for academic success. thus contributing to this body of knowledge which is dedicated to student engagement. Amongst others, an article by Saidi and Chalufu makes the argument about the need for higher education institutions to enhance student engagement as a mechanism for enabling students to play a purposive role in the development and governance of their institutions, in the creation of knowledge, or what Prof. Linkabula refers to, co-creation of knowledge, in the facilitation of their own learning experiences, and ultimately in the development, in their development as good citizens. Again, I think this links very nicely to with what Ira's argument about an engaged, democratic, civic university is all about. So, as I finish up, Chair, in a nutshell, my brief presentation this morning was aimed at highlighting 4 aspects, which I think are linked to student-centeredness. 1, the centrality of student affairs and services practitioners in creating student-centered institutions. 2, the role and purpose of higher education and its significance for a student-centered university, for student-centered universities. And then 3, the issue of institutional cultures, which we can engage later in the discussion as well. And 4thly, the aspect of student engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chalufu, for a very expansive presentation. We will now introduce our next speaker, Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town. The bio notes, again, of all the speakers are available in the conference pack. Over to you, Prof. Phakeng.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you to Dr. Chalufu for the presentation, very instructive and inspirational. I'm going to regard my input this morning as a provocation. I want it to be a provocation. I hope that we get an opportunity to engage after this. In an article entitled How Industries Change in Harvard Business Review, Anita McGahan, a professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, identifies 2 kinds of threats to the business sector. The first is a threat to a business's core activities. But if Professor McGahan were speaking to us today, she might point out how the higher education sector is evolving to make online learning a part of our activities. The second threat that Professor McGahan refers to affects an industry's core assets. And these include, she argues, our relationships with the people we serve, such as students. If Professor McGahan were here, I believe she would advise that South Africa's universities need to re-examine our relationship with students because their identity has changed so dramatically since the advent of democracy in 1994. What we learned during the Fees Must Fall protests that began in 2015 and lasted well into 2018 was that if the higher education sector does not highlight an area of inequality, our students will highlight it. This is because those inequalities speak to their very identity. Inequalities feed into the mental health issues students face, regardless of how smart they are. Today's new university student feels at a disadvantage from the moment he or she comes onto campus. Too often, their first impression of university just underlines their status as members of a disadvantaged group. Widening access to higher education has been the focus of us here at University of Cape Town for decades. UCT's current admissions policy, which was instituted in 2014, seeks to reflect the intersectionality of historic disadvantage by using 3 mechanisms for selection. One part of the incoming class is selected just on marks. A second component is selection based on performance and ability, which takes into account school and home background. And a third component is driven by achieving demographic targets based on an applicant's race and performance. However, as the years of recent protests demonstrated, gaining admission to university is not real transformation. During the protests, Black staff and students alike made it clear to the executives across the country that they needed to feel that the university belongs to them. Here at UCT, the students and staff were very clear that they were not at UCT just to be assimilated into an historically white, male, Western thinking culture. They needed to feel at home in the institution. And this realization has required us to make important changes in our institutional culture. While different protesters had different demands, whether it was fees must fall, patriarchy must fall, roads must fall, or any other call, the underlying message was that they were not at UCT just to be assimilated into a historically white, male, Western thinking culture. They needed to feel at home in the institution, and so we realized that we needed to make important changes in our institutional culture. As we began initiating those changes, one of the results we began seeing before COVID-19 was that the front rows in lecture halls were no longer occupied by just white students as before. Black students were beginning to understand that they co-own the space in the lecture halls of UCT. So were Black staff members. Talking with these students and colleagues and learning about their hopes for higher education made me realize that as a sector, we need to broaden our own aspirations. While it's true that education can change lives, as we say mostly when we talk to poor students, we need to consider how lives should also change education. We also need to rethink how we interface with students in other ways, including our administration practices. Sometime last year, I was in a conversation with a highly respected and well-known business person, South African, who is also a philanthropist and former CEO of a nationwide service provider. And he said to me, he wanted to run for president of the SRC at the university where he had decided to enroll for a postgraduate certificate part-time. Of course, I was excited and I thought, wow, I would be happy to have you as my president of SRC. But what was his reason? He said to me, universities do not know how to treat students. He said, you treat students like trash. He described to me in detail the months of correspondence he went through with that university's administration departments to get a refund he qualified for. As an A+ business executive and lots of money with decades of experience in customer and stakeholder relations, he understood the importance of building respect with the people a business sector serves. Universities often forget to think that way. Of course, I did send the Vice-Chancellor a WhatsApp and said to the Vice-Chancellor, you probably want to set up lunch with this person because they are your potential donor and currently they are your students. And they will give you honest feedback on how you can change how you treat your students. If an educated person, widely respected business executive with all his resources, battles to get a university to listen to him, how do we expect our students to feel about us? So it is important to question our assumptions about our students. We assume that students from low socioeconomic class are underprepared for university because of factors such as poor schooling and lack of resources. And so we can go on and on, talk at length about how underprepared they are. These assumptions may have some validity, but I often wonder if it is not also possible that the university is underprepared for teaching and assessing working class students. We seem to be better prepared as universities to admit and serve middle class students. And we need to critique that. The underpreparedness or unpreparedness many of our students experience has to do with culture, not intellect. It has to do with the traumatic home environments so many students come from as a result of poverty, the effects of HIV/AIDS or other infectious diseases on their families and communities, unemployment, and the restrictions placed on their parents and grandparents by apartheid. It also has to do with the language they are used to speaking. Across the South African university, success tends to be either racialized or confined to a particular socioeconomic class. To me, that indicates a built-in middle-class prejudice on the part of the higher education sector. An expectation that the students will transform by assimilating into a black or white or black or female version of the middle class, Western thinking, male graduates that have dominated graduation ceremonies over centuries. We often talk about how education changes lives, as if education itself is benign, innocent, and free of prejudice. Of course, sometimes we talk about its politics. But yet, when we walk to the front of a lecture hall, we bring our assumptions about our students into our lessons. I propose instead that lives should also change education. We need to consider the political purposes that are assigned to education. What is taught, who teaches, and how it's taught. One example of how education is political is the belief that the dropouts are always to blame. If a matriculant enters university without the basic mathematics preparation that is needed for a first-year science program, we blame the high school and the public education system. We even go on television programs to offer critiques. But when a student fails a university course, a first-year course, and they came with all distinctions, we blame the students. We never take any responsibility. Am I saying we should take all responsibility? Of course I'm not. But I'm saying, why is it that we as academics feel that it is okay to expect teachers to take responsibility when their matriculants fail, but not so much us at university? So I want to invite us to consider this question. How many students drop out of university because they do not see the world in the way they are taught? And of course, dropouts for the most part are from marginalized groups. As an educator and vice-chancellor, I often wonder whether there is a possibility that some of the students emerge as dropouts from our universities because they are resisting or refusing to read the world the way they are being taught it. How much of the values of our underrepresented groups or marginalized groups is embedded in the education we present to them? Do we even know what their values are? Are we humble enough as a sector and as institutions to prepare ourselves for diversity? Well, maybe I should say, are we even humble enough to engage on these controversial issues that I'm raising? Well, maybe they're not controversial, but we just don't want to talk about them. This needs to be part of our sector's commitment to social responsiveness. Inclusion and diversity means seeking to include all kinds of viewpoints across all kinds of borders: race, gender, sexuality, nationality, language, culture. The list is as varied as our personal identities. This approach applies not only to institutions in South Africa, of course, but also to those in countries elsewhere in the world, like the US. Freeman Hrabowski, the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a co-founder of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, told a TED Talk that most American students who begin a science degree program in university drop out after first year. And the demographic group that is most likely to do so is African Americans. Dr. Hrabowski said, we need to be changing the culture of science in our country as we think about having more students of all races. I mean, he could be talking about the South African environment. Real transformation requires a commitment at all levels of the institution, including executive decisions across the university. We at UCT established our Office of Inclusivity and Change to address issues of diversity and transformation, including support for students and staff with disabilities, survivor support for people who experience sexual and gender-based violence, and developing a student-centered approach to all challenges that students face. We have a long way to go, but it's a good thing that we've started. Africa is the world's youngest continent, with almost 60% of the population under the age 25. Our students and graduates have the potential to serve the world with African innovation. As I've said before, Africa has been largely overlooked by the world as a contributor to potential solutions to the many problems the world is dealing with today. By re-examining our relationship with students, we are not only protecting our core assets as a higher education sector, we can open up fresh approaches to higher education that will not only help to transform our sector, but also our wider society and even the world. This is true leadership that can boost not only the academic sector in South Africa, but also our global standing as a country and a continent. I look forward to the engagement. Thanks very much, Professor van Staden.
Thank you, Professor Phakeng, for a very informative and, I must say, very passionate address to us here. Colleagues, we will now continue with our question and answer session. Are there any questions, Bernadette? Okay, we'll do that. We will move on then with our first respondent, Mr. Luthando Jack, who is the Dean of Students at the Nelson Mandela University. Over to you, Mr. Jack.
Thank you so much, Prof. van Staden. Good morning to everyone, all protocol observed. Thank you so much to Dr. Chalufu and the VC of the University of Cape Town for such thought-provoking inputs. Just as a way of beginning my response, I think what I'm hearing from the two colleagues resonates with a view about higher education institutions in relation to society, a view that suggests that universities view themselves as these super working and effective systems that work, and that everybody that is connected to them, be it students, be it parents, be it communities, must then adapt to their ways. And I think, therefore, this question about cultivating a student-centered university ought to be juxtaposed, against that that perception or belief or view that is held, by many, in society. And I think the points that the two speakers have made, and particularly premising Dr. Chalufu, his input by reminding us about the purposes of higher education, because I think student-centeredness cannot be insulated from the role of higher education in a society like South Africa, in a continent like Africa, as well as in a world that is deeply becoming unequal. So therefore, I think we need to, the question that you ask, what is student-centeredness? I think it needs not to be divorced, from the purposes of higher education. And of course, then the questions that flow from that, including the question of cultivating a responsive institutional culture, ought to be informed by what we view as the purpose, of higher education, particularly in a changing society. And I think the point that Prof. Phakeng, is making about this new student that comes to higher education, what I normally call the changing profile of students that come to higher education. Sometimes the point that Prof. Phakeng is making, sometimes or most of the time, our systems, processes, as well as our orientation is not in sync with this new student that comes every year to our university because of our orientation that says we are perfect. Everybody that comes to university ought to adapt to our context, as institutions of higher learning. So in other words, at the moment, we center ourselves, our beliefs, our practices, and therefore serving ourselves as opposed to centering our students with their diversity, both in terms of their socio-economic as well as cultural backgrounds, and as well as their own ways of knowing, which is, I think, really very, very important. So therefore, in my view, I think a student centrism is about a partnership between students and the university. Not just students and the university, but students, the university and society. But not just a partnership, but an equalizing partnership, amongst all these players. It's about core learning. It's about really a recognition of what your so-called community cultural assets, that as students come to university, they come with their own assets. Part of those assets, as you also put it, is their aspirational capital, social capital, a familial capital, that is the capital of their own communities as well as their own families, a navigational capital. So we've got to, therefore, our education, as Prof. Phakeng put it, our education system has got to recognize and affirm them as opposed to alienating them, I think, as Sibusiso was saying. In other words, there must be continuity between the lives they live in their families, in their communities, and the life and their lives, in the university, as opposed to them being disoriented. So a student-centric approach, therefore, is about reorienting the university, and it's about emancipating the university from itself, from its own dogmas. It's about unlearning these old ways of doing business, which were informed by a particular paradigm that I think the two speakers clearly clearly articulated. So I would just want to end there, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jack. You had some very, very key issues raised here, and indeed, it will make us to think deeply about, this student-centeredness at universities. Colleagues, I just would like to indicate that the second respondent, Ms. Nobubele Phuza, is not able to connect. So therefore, it is possible for us to share the 10 minutes as we move along to the other respondents, or maybe we can use it in the ends during the question and answer session. So in this case, we will then directly move to respondent 3 on the program, Dr. W.P. Wahl. He is the researcher and director of student affairs at the University of the Free State. The bio notes, of course, is in the conference pack. So over to you, Dr. Wahl.
Thank you very much, Professor van Staden, and thank you for the opportunity to respond to the 2 very excellent presentations that we have received. So I would like to structure my response in two categories. The first category, I'm going to just briefly touch on the National Research Project on Student-Centeredness that the Transformation Strategy Group from USAf is facilitating. I'm the principal investigator of that project, and I just want to touch and illuminate some aspects of that project. And then I will relate that to some of the comments that our 2 presenters made. So the USAf study actually really revolves around reshaping institutional cultures to create a student-centered higher education system. It's a Delphi study, so we engage experts in the field where we create expert panels and get input on various questions and various categories concerning student-centeredness. But I think what I would like to highlight first is that the advisory board from USAf and the team actually then create a conceptual document just to create a conceptual framework that could guide us in drafting this study. And in that regard, we have highlighted from the word go in the conceptualization of the study 7 aspects that we feel would be important in reshaping institutional cultures to become more student-centered. So the first aspect, now I'm just going to mention them briefly. The first aspect is really an attempt to try understand our students, so that institutions to begin with should have inclination or a willingness or a drive to understand students as we move along. In other words, what are their socioeconomic conditions? Are they food secure? What are they reading? What are they not reading? What is the level of preparedness for the university, and so on and so forth. Secondly, we thought in the conceptualization of the study, a university should have a good understanding of the faculty members and the staff of the university. I think Prof. Phakeng underlined that it is people that are actually creating student-centeredness in our institutions. And we also highlighted that in our conceptualization. The third starting point would be to understand whether the institutional culture is open to transformational change. And I think it also touches on what Professor Phakeng started with on how industries change. But when we talk about shaping institutional cultures to become more student-centered, we need to look at the willingness and the openness of institutional cultures, how open they are for institutional change. The fourth starting point, we think, would be to understand the interweaving between the institution and the socioeconomic contexts. In other words, to have a bit more of a systemic ecological approach to student-centeredness. The fifth starting point would be to understand the responsibility of articulating the intellectual project of the institution with regards to global challenges, such as the Sustainable Developmental Goals, other challenges like global warming, climate change, and so on, and how that finds actually a root in local contexts. The sixth point that we raised was all about the impact and possibility of technology for staff and students in the development of digital learning and digital pedagogy, sort of put focus in the future. I think that's an important aspect to consider in terms of student-centeredness. And then lastly, we thought the whole human development and human capabilities approach and framework to activate the agency of students would be crucial in that regard. So we're busy with the interviews. We've got about two-thirds of the interviews done, and I thought it would be helpful maybe just to share in terms of defining student-centeredness what came out of the qualitative data up to date. And I'm intentional in that, maybe a bit of a Socratic approach here, but just first defining what I think is student-centeredness, and I do that intentionally because it relates to a lot to what the two speakers said. So I think what came out of our data is that a lot of the respondents felt that student-centeredness lost its meaning, right? It was a term that actually started to move from teacher and teaching-centeredness to learning and learner-centeredness. That was the origin, but it's so overused that it actually lost its meaning. And but it really, at the essence, it's all about designing learning and pedagogies around students. And so we've identified up to now 5 characteristics that relates to student-centeredness. The first characteristic is really understanding students, who they are, where do they come from, and so on, and really to move from rhetoric to reality, the reality of students, really understanding students very clearly. The second characteristic is responsiveness. To design institutions, to design processes in such a way that it's responsive to the learning and developmental needs of students. The third characteristic is what I label reciprocity. In other words, that there should be this reciprocity of co-creation, of co-governance between students and institutions, which forms a critical part of student-centeredness in higher education. The fourth characteristic is just the outcomes, a focus on the outcomes of students. In other words, what kind of student do we release? It relates to graduateness or graduate attributes. Are they prepared for the world of work? Some of the speakers also related to that. And then the fifth component is all about community, the university community, creating a sense of belonging. And it does not convey the idea that it's a student-run university, but that students are an important component and an important stakeholder, a valued stakeholder in the entire student community. Student-centeredness is therefore not, it moves away from that the student is the customer, so it moves away from consumerism, commercialization, and market-driven approach to higher education. I did say it's not a student-run university. And there's also limits to what came out. There's also limits to support of students. Universities is not the state. It cannot take over the role of the state in supporting certain social ills of society. And so there's a big warning that came out of that. So I'm going to move now, Chair, to just respond to some of the aspects that our speakers spoke about. I'm going to start with Dr. Chalufu. I think he highlighted very importantly that there's a shift that happened in higher education in terms of the global pandemic. And I think what's important there is that in terms of student-centeredness, Dr. Chalufu highlighted that the environment of learning shifted beyond the boundaries of the campus. Suddenly students are at home, and societies actually also become part then of the learning environment and should be included in our conceptualization of student-centeredness. So in that regard, Sabina Hayden and Manja Klemenchik wrote a brilliant book published by Routledge, and they coined the term student-centered ecologies or ecological systems in terms of student-centeredness. And I think we should factor that in our thinking about student-centeredness. Dr. Chalufu also highlighted the role of the student affairs practitioners or professionals. And what's important, I think what he highlights there is that student-centeredness cuts across the institution. It's not only academic and in the classroom and in faculties, but all the different role players becomes critical components in creating and reshaping institutions to become student-centered. He asked a very important question, and that is, for what? For what is do we want to pursue student-centeredness? And you know, that touches a little bit on what I highlighted earlier, that student-centeredness relates to the outcome of the educational experience. In other words, creating citizens and preparing students so that they become leaders in society for the public good. Dr. Chalufu also highlighted the systemic aspect, and he asked questions about the governance aspect of institutions, the operational aspect, teaching and learning, and in that regard, opened up the systemic aspect of student-centeredness, which I think is crucial. He highlighted also institutional cultures as a key to success, focusing on student engagement. And in that regard, I think he relates the notion of student-centeredness very, very importantly to the notion of student engagement. And I think that's a critical link that he made there that we should not forget in our conceptualization of student-centeredness. And then lastly, the involvement of students, very importantly, in co-creating and co-governing our institutions, which is crucial to student-centeredness. Then moving on to Professor Phakeng, very, very insightful presentation. I think what she highlighted first is the relationship with our students. And so in that regard, she brought in, for me, the human aspect of student-centeredness. Sometimes it can become a very clinical term or an operational term, but what Prof. Phakeng highlights is really the human aspect of who they are. And I think what we need to say here is that data-driven or evidence-based practice need to be part of this. We can't work on anecdotal evidence, but we need to bring in evidence-based practice to really understand who our students are, what their needs are, and how to be responsive to them. She also highlighted the very important aspect of a sense of belonging for students. For me, it touches on the whole narrative about decolonization of higher education. The work of Claude Steele, the psychologist, opened up to us the notion of stereotype threat, so that when students come into environments where they do not feel they belong and they feel that certain stereotypes might apply to them, it has got a direct impact on their ability to perform academically and in other aspects. So I think in terms of student success, the notion of belonging is really crucial. She again highlighted the value of the student as a human being, bringing in the humanizing pedagogy in what we do. And I think also opening up the critical jump from the 4th Industrial Revolution to the 5th Industrial Revolution, where we bring in the human component. So I think for the future of universities, that is crucial. She also then asked a very critical question, in my opinion, how prepared are universities for students, and open up the notion of underpreparedness of institutions. And for me, bringing in the idea that universities should enter into self-reflection, be courageous enough to reshape and redesign also their processes and structures to be responsive to students. So just to end off with, I just want to highlight 3 themes that really cut across both respondents that I just picked up. Both respondents, both presenters rather, highlighted the challenge of mental health. I think that is a specific focus that we need to keep in mind in creating responsive and student-centered institutions, the notion of mental health. The idea of access, but not only access that also translate into success, not only success at the institution, but also success beyond the student experience when students enter into the world of work. And we should keep that in mind. That's an important aspect. And I did speak about the decolonization that I think is a strong theme that also came out in both presenters. So, so I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much, Professor van Staden. Very insightful presentations, and I think it can help significantly, in the words of Prof. Phakeng, to reposition Africa as a continent that will provide hope globally. Thank you very much.
Okay, again, thank you, Dr. Wahl, again for a very insightful presentation. We will now move on to our third respondent, Professor Pamela Dube. She's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Student Development and Support at the University of the Western Cape. Over to you, Prof. Dube.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. Morning to you all colleagues, and thanks again to Prof. Phakeng and Dr. Chalufu for a stimulating session, and which really had very wide-ranging and thoughtful perspectives. And also thank you to my fellow respondents who have actually synthesized the key issues very well and given a very comprehensive and compelling take on what's been presented. But Chair, just in further enhancing some of the important issues, I'd like to make these statements, which can be taken also as some kind of concluding practical ideas, if you like, and which pertain in particular to broader student and institutional participation, feedback and assessment for better alignment. We talk often about how it takes a whole village to raise a child. There was a lot of mention, and I'm sure especially from Professor Phakeng about how real transformation and student-centeredness requires a whole university stakeholder commitment and participation. So while we talk a lot about how a whole village can raise a child, not much is talked about in terms of intentional planning that goes into it, that puts the child, as it were, in the center. So I can only reiterate how important it is to be intentional about student-centeredness in our institutional strategies, especially, and to be clear right from the onset on performance indicators and how we mean to assess progress. So I thought I would mention that because there are quite a number of interventions that we make that in terms of student engagements, and then we encounter problems in terms of tracking, performance and progress and so on. In addition, Chair, to the perspective on knowing or getting to know and understand our students the best way that we can, on a day-to-day basis, I think we can streamline the ways in which we as universities communicate with and can claim to really know our students. We need to get better, for instance, at joined up use of data and using student data to create a single understanding and knowledge of the student's circumstances, so that we avoid situations where a student has to explain the same issue to a number of university offices, be it in the academic or administrative and professional services spaces. That has been mentioned also in the presentations around how ready are our universities to be responsive to student needs and to be understanding. I mean, that touching example of an industry role player and business person who was struggling to be able to get the information or the assistance that they needed, points also to some of the gaps that we have then when it comes to even how in those spaces we respond to our students who need assistance. Clearly, there should be, of course, due consideration and sensitivity when it comes, for instance, to survivor information in cases of assault or GBV and related. However, there are opportunities too that can be created to know our students beyond the pedagogy encounters in the lecture room and beyond the help-seeking interaction or from a deficit perspective. As we know, students, and not many of us actually know this, but they do possess multiplicities of talents and skills, which mostly are experienced in the core curricular space of sports, cultural, political, or religious activities. I know Dr. Chalufu spoke a lot about the proximity of student affairs practitioners and entities to students who get to appreciate more often than maybe most other role players at universities, the students in their multi-dimensional identities. There are opportunities, of course, to also engage students in the faculty co-curricular spaces, on outreach projects, for instance, or faculty-linked student structures, clubs and societies, as well as in mentorship and coaching programs, where faculties then get to appreciate students in more dimensions than just the whole knowledge exchange from what, the singular knowledge exchange that tends to happen. Simple things like streamlining the ways in which universities communicate with students and offering workplace skills, for instance, work skills programs, and creating career development opportunities alongside their studies. I know yesterday one of the SAASSAP student leaders, I think it was Lerato, mentioned how student affairs could work even closer with deans and faculties to offer upskilling programs like in entrepreneurship and so on. It's these efforts that can have an immediate and measurable impact on student experience. So too would the promotion of career search and workplace preparation tools and periodic review of systems and upgrades of those systems which may be ineffective. We need to build more information than currently available on the impact of the many interventions and student support or development initiatives. Like I said before, there are limited instruments currently at national and institutional level. On the whole, as much as we've talked about the limitations in terms of our social inequalities and so on, but on the whole, today's students are armed with better and far more information than previous generations, not only about access, but also about which universities are best performers, and they seek greater clarity in terms of about those universities and what those universities can offer them in terms of student experience, both in and out of the lecture room, and even in terms of employability prospects. Just as an example, I read a PA consulting survey of UK vice-chancellors, which found that 59% of those vice-chancellors that were responded to the survey felt that maximizing teaching excellence was a top strategic priority. But while 79% prioritized student satisfaction over league table rankings. So the shift towards more student-centric universities has been happening for some time, but very slowly. There has been more debates on the concept than instances of genuinely actualizing it beyond the quick fix concessions that some of us have experienced in times of student protests to buy peace. Another interesting read actually was on the annual student docu World University Ranking, which is on the EdTech platform, which for the first time recently included South African universities in their annual ranking report on student experience. It's got about 100,000 users in South Africa, and 254 universities or campuses were surveyed and were ranked by current students. And it is encouraging to note that South African students, although I think really generously across the board, ranked their universities highly in terms of student experience. and in particular in the categories, out of the 16 categories, but categories that prioritize sports, campus culture, location, safety. Not only does this ranking focus on academic quality, but also on overall campus life. We know from presentations that have been done, including even yesterday, I think from Thandi Lewin, who mentioned that at one point it's one thing to see results at a systemic level, but when you go delve into the details and you engage individuals, sometimes you get a totally different picture. So while this is an encouraging first student experience ranking report that's been done by Stu Doku World University Ranking, it is very important though to still look at the details as have been presented actually by all presenters, including the respondents, in terms of how prepared our universities to be really holistically responsive to our student needs. And what what is in place and how do we measure it and the impact in terms of its effectiveness. So while much has been said about inclusion and taking into consideration the diversity of our students' needs and context, I want to add again the importance of promoting student-led initiatives for students and participation of both students and staff in some of those initiatives. I know that Dr. Wahl mentioned from his report that a student-centered university doesn't mean that it's a student-led university. So here I'm talking about the importance of extending the inclusion of the diversity of student voices and context, also within initiatives that are student-led. Like for instance, in fundraising campaigns for special projects like food security, or in leading dialogues, especially on policy implementation and effectiveness of policy, on issues of gender equality and masculinities, or in leading initiatives on, as I said, implementation of new policies, and especially around this period where there have been, in this COVID pandemic period, where there has been a lot of impact on student performance, having students also lead dialogues around their lived experience of the interventions that universities have been have taken initiatives in terms of addressing student needs currently, especially for the digital and data needs and so on, and how engaged the students are in terms of their academic agenda. I know there have been surveys that are very encouraging, but as what we tend to focus on is the improvements, and then we don't look so much also on the ones that still continue to feel left behind. How do we get them to present themselves and how that we get to appreciate and address the needs that they still have. And a lot was said also about students with disabilities in that regard. We've looked at some of the information in terms of students with disability engagement, especially during the pandemic. And that's part of being really centric, student-centric, in just making sure that no student gets left behind, especially in this period. We talk a lot about pockets of excellence, what I call the pockets of excellence syndrome. I think the reference to pockets of good practice that are dotted around the institution is not acceptable anymore. We know universities are capable of remodeling themselves at both strategic level and in their day-to-day activities. They can incubate good ideas and make them mainstream across the whole institution. So as Dr. Chalufu mentioned around institutional culture and the challenges around that, and that it can be shaped to be responsive to student needs. And as Mr. Jack also argued, the university can unlearn and participate in terms of construction and can change the university's trajectory in terms of its responsiveness towards students. So just really to reiterate, in connection with the report that Dr. Wahl talked to, I think it's very important that he highlighted the people aspect, and Prof. Phakeng also highlighted that, especially in relation to our relationship with students, the nature of our relationship with students, because it is people that make up a university community, and being open to shaping institutional change will take people to make that change. So I really do think that the 5 characteristics that Dr. Wahl outlined, which form part of the report, are very instructive as part of this work going forward. And I think there is a lot to learn from there. Chair, I just wanted to avoid actually reiterating a number of things that have already been said, but I really do appreciate being part of this session, and I really look forward to the engagements. And thank you again to the presenters and the fellow respondents. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, maybe from my side now, let's start to speak maybe about linking resources to the student-centeredness. And here we think about the current NSFAS allocation to our students. That is a key aspect of creating an environment for our students so that they can flourish at our universities. And what I don't hear is what are the situation with the so-called missing middle students. That is quite a big group. At some of the universities, it could be almost half of the students are in the so-called missing middle students. I just would like some reflection on that as well, if you would agree that funding is an issue for our students.
Professor Van Staden, let me offer other thoughts. I mean, I don't want to talk about NSFAS because I think that it's a safe space to go to, and then we get upset with government and so on and so forth. I think we just a little bit of thinking outside the box, maybe a crazy idea. That's the thing. I often I have made this argument elsewhere that the way corporates offer bursaries in our country is, I think, is problematic. Students get bursaries only on the basis of merit. That's not to say merit is not important, but offering a scholarship or a bursary, I don't think is the optimal way of always of acknowledging merit. I think we can find other ways of acknowledging merit, particularly in a country such as ours, where we have where the need is so large, and because and that's because performance at school or varsity is never. I mean, given what I said earlier, I mean, the way education is structured to be consistent with middle class values, it is obvious that many of the students who get the merit bursaries will be from middle class backgrounds. And I often wonder whether there isn't a reason for us to reconsider and agree that scholarships should consider both merit and need. So that's not to say merit alone. Merit it's not important, but you bring merit and need together, and so that you don't have the children of the wealthy getting the scholarships when in fact the wealthy can pay, or children of people who can afford. I mean, you and I should pay for our children, but they would easily get prestigious scholarships. If we exclude that and find another way of acknowledging that, and they can write it on their CV because that's what they want, then we'll probably have a larger pocket, another pocket that recognizes a need, and perhaps it will cover a lot of students from the missing middle. I think that's something that we can do. I don't think it gets done by universities necessarily alone. I think it gets done also by corporates and all the funding agencies that offer scholarships. But we, the middle class and the upper middle class, must disabuse ourselves of getting all of these things because our children are advantaged. So actually they will perform better and they'll get the scholarships. I want to propose that because I'm not sure that we are doing enough to think creatively about that. I mean, we can talk even more about how do you maximize NSFAS funds that we have. I mean, I think there's a big issue of, I mean, it's almost like we are scared to talk about how long it takes students to complete a 3-year degree. And we should start a conversation about that, both with students and with universities. Because that also creates a situation where more working class children can get the NSFAS.
Thank you, Professor Phakeng. I often also wonder to what extent universities should not establish their own scholarship and bursary funds for, you know, for the missing middle. However, I would like to maybe pose a question on how can we pursue partnerships to broaden the funding base for students. If we maybe can reflect on that. Yeah. Any reflection on partnerships, in particular strategic, vibrant, equal partnerships, colleagues?
Chair, I don't want it to be a monopoly of Vice-Chancellor, so I'm not going to speak.
No, you can continue, Prof.
No, I'm not. Just now they will call me a name. I'm not doing it. So
I will protect you, Prof.
wow, where? Like when?
Yeah, boy.
Yes, Chair,
Yeah,
if I may.
Yes, please, Pamela, come in.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm having, you know, now and again a problem moving my mouse to the to unmute, so it takes time. I think, I mean, Chair, it's really efforts at national and institutional levels, you know, that can work towards solving this problem. The partnerships we've talked about, industry. I mean, a number of universities, as we know, have got also partnerships with industry, with banks. But really at national level, the kind of efforts that have been made, I mean, I remember even for the former chair of the, you know, of NSFAS, you know, started another kind of drive where banks were involved at national level to be addressing the missing middle students. But I'm not so sure that that's a model that can be replicated for all, you know, missing middle students, or even for as part of the improvement of NSFAS challenges that keep coming, you know, that keep coming up. But I think it's really about looking for more funding with our partners. Given the current challenges with the pandemic, we've been having quite a lot of problems in reaching out to partners to assist with more funding. There, others have pulled out, but it's really a matter of really nurturing the partnerships that exist, that we have, and looking probably also more beyond the continent. Fundraising activities, as you know, are happening across universities. Sometimes we also look at the same pool, the same kind of partnerships for the same thing. And that's why I really think a national coordinated kind of approach would also add value, so that because we are all basically looking for the same thing on behalf of our students. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Dube. I'm in particular very interested in what Prof. Dube, you mentioned student-centeredness and impact studies, and if my understanding is correct, you say we are lacking instruments. Can you elaborate, or any of the other people in the meeting?
It's just about the impact in terms of the effectiveness of the interventions that we are doing in terms of engaging with our students or adding value in terms of student life experience. We've got the SAASSAP, the sort of surveys. So I was talking in terms of surveys and kind of feedback mechanisms, and that they are quite limited at the moment, and they try to cover everything. I think we need to have to do more work really in terms of, and not wait for a national survey, but also institutionally get to have more, measuring kind of instruments and feedback just to get to hear from our students what their lived experience of the interventions and the impact of those interventions are. That's what I mentioned.
Okay, thanks. Then I would like to also engage Dr. Wahl regarding the reshaping of university cultures. For me, that is quite a mouthful, Dr. Wahl. Can you elaborate on that? Reshaping university cultures.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the first question would be, what actually constitutes a university culture, before one can even start to think about, how to reshape. And then the second question would be, what would be the important role players and what would be the important processes to follow to reshape institutional cultures. So I think the speakers touch on various aspects of what constitutes institutional culture. Certainly it touches on a sense of belonging. It touches on the operational aspect of cultures. It touches on the personnel, both academics and support services personnel. It touches on the way in which decisions are made. So for me, institutional cultures are multidimensional. It touches on various aspects of the institution. And when we speak about reshaping institutional cultures, I think we speak about, especially in the context of student-centeredness, the core question for me is, how do we place the student and the learning and developmental needs of students at the core of the way in which we organize ourselves, so that we can become more responsive, so that we can be more flexible in response to what students need to learn and to develop.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wahl. I would like us to focus a bit on international students at institutions. There's place for international students around the world, and South Africa is a bit slow implementing this for local students. Can we reflect on this? Is there somebody who would like to reflect on international students?
I think you should get other colleagues, Chair. I worry that the other colleagues are like a monopoly of the microphone.
No, that's great, Prof. Phakeng, but the opportunity is there for anyone to join us. So are there any person who would like to just reflect on international students? Because if we speak student-centeredness, we cannot only look at South Africans. Is there somebody who would like to reflect on international students? How do we deal with that group?
I can talk to that. I mean, I don't see it as just how do we deal with international students, but having students from different countries on our campuses what value does it add to the university? We at UCT talk about internationalization at home and the value of having students from over 100 countries on campus. It adds to the experience of the students. The fact that students get an opportunity to interact with people who come from other countries here at home, because not all of them would be able to travel. It's also based on the idea of the power of diversity and how much we grow. I mean, if you think about why traveling widens our horizons, it's not only in terms of what you see, it's in terms of who you engage with and what you talk about, and the fact that you come from different backgrounds. So I wouldn't necessarily talk about just having international students on campus, but I think the value of diversity, a diverse cohort of students on campus is good for our country and for our universities, because there's power in diversity. And having students learning how to engage across different cultures, whether those cultures are located in the continent or outside the continent, I think it ensures that they get prepared beyond just being able to hold their own in their disciplines, but to be able to hold their own anywhere in the world and know that they have something to offer, irrespective of the fact that they come from a village here in South Africa. Many students come to our campuses, certainly. I mean, I interact with many students here at UCT who it is the first time that they come to Cape Town. They may be from Limpopo, they haven't been even to Gauteng, to Johannesburg, and it's their getting out to study for their higher education degrees that they get the exposure. So this kind of diversity, racially, culturally, and nationally, is important. It's good. It can contribute to building a social cohesion in our country. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Prof. Phakeng. Colleagues, we have about half a minute left. I just want to put one other thought on your minds, and this is, what are your views for varsities to share the admission of students from working class instead of some higher education institutions carrying a disproportionate burden? We don't have time to reflect on that, but that is a key question for me. The other point is, I would like now to conclude due to a lack of time, and I would like to thank all the participants for their valuable contributions here today. And my concluding remark is indeed, it's for me about the humanizing pedagogy, reinventing the principles and practice of education as a journey towards student liberation. This is just a statement I would like to leave you with. So on this note, colleagues, again, thank you very much for your valuable contributions. I thank all of you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.